In this last segment of the lesson, we are going to look at barrier factors that limit the development of vocabulary. Hopefully, the background information contained in this section will help you better understand your learners with limited English proficiency. You might recall that those learners are not all English language learners. That is, not all students with limited proficiency in English speak another language as their first language. We know that many times other factors interact in the development of problems with literacy and other academic issues. These issues are barriers to learning. The information in this section may not be new to you, but hopefully you will look at it again with an eye to how this affects the way you plan and deliver instruction in your own practice. The first thing we need to do is understand what we actually mean by working vocabulary. We have more than one vocabulary in our cognitive toolbox, no matter what our age. Some examples might be words that we understand, that is the receptive vocabulary, words that we use, expressive vocabulary, and words with special uses, such as academic or discipline vocabulary. It is generally thought that we understand more words than we use. We use words that are most comfortable in our daily communication. It takes specific teaching or direct instruction to connect words that we may or may not understand, the receptive vocabulary, to words that we use in reading, writing, and speaking, the expressive vocabulary. In our Oklahoma Academic Standards for English Language Arts, we are tasked with adding a layer of academic vocabulary to be incorporated into the receptive and expressive vocabulary. The bottom line is we must increase the overall working vocabulary of our learners to foster academic success. Achieving integration of our vocabularies is not an easy task. Hart and Risley launched a landmark study that is still impacting research in vocabulary and language acquisition. They studied a group of children over a 5-year period to see what impact home environment and other factors had on later reading achievement and overall academic achievement. Their findings have been replicated many times over the past 15 years. The sad fact is that no matter how hard teachers worked to create interventions, any gains in vocabulary were temporary. None of the gains generalized outside of the classroom. Teachers could not and cannot change the developmental trajectory. That trajectory is set in motion long before we ever see children in our classrooms. The end result of this phenomenon is that by high school, students from low SES environments may not have a working academic receptive vocabulary, the words they understand, and expressive vocabulary, words they use. At any rate, this working vocabulary for academics may not be large enough to understand the words used in their textbooks. Let's recap those findings. Despite intervention, increases in vocabulary after instruction were temporary, even when the intervention was intensive. The instruction did not accelerate the growth of vocabulary beyond direct teaching. Teachers could not change the developmental trajectory, and the ultimate result is that in high school, many children from families in poverty lacked the vocabulary to be able to read their own textbooks. In Risley's and other studies, the children in the study turned out just like their parents. Now, I know that sounds like some sort of an indictment, but it's important to understand here that this is more a prediction than a subtractive statement. Children absorb the language they hear. It's completely reasonable that most of their words are the same words in their parents' or their caregivers' vocabularies. In the Hart and Risley study, parent and child speech was recorded and analyzed. It is instructive to realize that by 36 months, children have the same words and vocabulary as their parents. Children use the words they know in talking and in building their conceptual structures. This is a very informative slide. In this slide, you can see the number of words, the recorded vocabulary size, that was heard on the recordings. The pre-test score refers to the score on the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test, or the PPVT. Notice the difference in the discourse patterns. Children in professional families had more than double the expressive and receptive vocabulary than those of the children in poverty. There are additional pressures affecting families struggling to take care of their families. But in the end result appears to be fewer words, tools, to bring to the job of learning to read. This study was not an isolated one. The same trends appear many times in the research over the last 25 years. Many investigators in literacy acquisition have noted that patterns and trends of language are well established by age 3. The frightening thing is, for those with attenuated language, the gap continues to grow, sometimes in alarming proportion. Emerging research indicates that the size of the working vocabulary at age 3 or 4 is a significant predictive indicator of reading proficiency, fluency, and comprehension by the end of 3rd grade. Study this graph closely for a moment. This graph shows a little more clearly the differences in cumulative vocabulary words between groups. Children at age 36 months from struggling families demonstrated about 1/3 the size of working vocabularies as children from higher social economic status environments. This seems to clearly indicate that the home environment social economic status had a major impact on cognitive and language development of the children in the home. The information on this graph is even more dramatic. It's mind-boggling to see that by age 3, there is a 30 million word gap in the amount of words addressed to the child in discourse with families and others. The great modifier, social economic status, is indeed a major player in literacy acquisition and in academic achievement in later grades. The first thing we have to ask is, what is going on here? Before we jump to conclusions, however, of child neglect, it's important to know that in the study by Hart and Risley, as well as those by others, the children were more alike in the care they received than one might assume. Hart and Risley were careful to note that the parents and caregivers followed in their study were much alike in terms of life training and nurturing of their children. All of the families nurtured their children and played and talked with them. They disciplined their children and taught them manners, dress, and toilet training. All of the children had pretty much the same toys. The children were talked to by their parents about much the same things. Children all learned to talk and to be socially appropriate members of their families with all the basic skills needed for preschool. So what was the difference? The children had only the words they heard from their parents and/or caregivers by the age of 36 months. 20 years later, the argument might be made that television provides a much larger vocabulary for children. But recall, children must have some understanding and connection to the word to be able to build a conceptual structure. They must practice it in their own speech and in discourse with others. Just hearing lots of words does not mean that children can use them correctly. This was one study. It was an important study because it was a catalyst for many subsequent studies, but they all support this initial study in their findings. Was the Hart and Risley study that new? No. Educators have been saying the same thing for years. Teachers have recognized this gap for years in their practice in the classroom. It was this study, however, that had the empirical data that caught our attention. Many children are relatively sheltered before age 3 when they may enter preschool or daycare for the first time. They are little learning machines at this period of their cognitive development, as their brains are hardwired to learn, especially language. Children in elementary years should learn about 8 or 9 new words per day to produce an average of about 8,000 to 9,000 words added to their working vocabularies per year. The academic vocabulary is critical in the preschool through 5th grade age range. In the Common Core state standards, there are 55 specific words that learners must incorporate into not only their working vocabularies, but also into their cognitive and conceptual structures. These are the words used not only in textbooks, but are used in tests as well. 2 excellent sources for building vocabulary are Marilee Spranger's Teaching the Vocabulary of the Common Core and Teaching Academic Content and Literacy, produced by the U.S. Department of Education. You will find both of those sources in the reference section. But recall the strength of the predictive validity of receptive vocabulary. Receptive vocabulary at age 3 had a strong predictive influence on language skills by 3rd grade. The current thinking is that after age 3, children should learn at least 2,000 to 3,000 new words per year just to break even. That is some heavy-duty information, which brings us back to where we started. Words, words, words. It now becomes clear just how vital it is to build vocabulary as early as possible. Think about the implication of knowing We call this epistemology. When we consider where that knowing originates, what does knowing a word imply? Let's look through the list. Knowing a word implies knowing many things about that word, its literal meaning, its various connotations, the sort of syntactic constructions into which it enters. That's a mouthful. The morphological options it offers, a rich array of semantic associates such as synonyms and antonyms. What does knowing a word imply? It's much more technical than it first appears when we consider the connections and the neural networks that words wire. If you have paid attention to no other slide, please perk up and listen to this one. It's easy to make the assumption that ELLs and LEPs are the same population, learners who speak another first language. However, that assumption is faulty. It is not unusual for children living in poverty to have a very diminished working vocabulary. 40 and 50 years ago, most kindergarten students entered school with an average working vocabulary of around 8,000 to 10,000 words. In some areas of the U.S., native English speakers from areas of high poverty have been found to have less than 1,000 words that would help them to prepare to learn the academic vocabulary, so important to academic achievement. Teachers need to have many tools in their instructional toolbox to help these learners. Let's understand for a moment why normal direct teaching of vocabulary may not work for learners with limited English proficiency. Those are our LAPs. They may have no cognitive context for the word. So what can we do? We can take advantage of their first language, and that first language may be a heavy dialect. We can ensure that limited English proficiency learners know the meaning of basic words. Above all, it is critical that LEP learners know words associated with concepts. Don't despair, we are going to go there. There's more to follow. As we have come full circle, let's revisit our original questions. What are some issues with language development? Who are the students most at risk for lags in language development? Think about how you would answer those questions based on our discussions. Has your viewpoint changed? How? Recall the list of 5 characteristics of limited English proficiency learners you made at the beginning of this lesson. I'd like you to create a new list of characteristics. Have your ideas changed? How? What are some ways you might reorganize current lessons to allow for making content more comprehensible to all English language learners? Stop the video for a moment and consider these 3 new questions that are on the slide. This is a good time to reflect on new information. How might this change your classroom practice? Make some notes while your ideas are fresh in your mind. You will want these notes as you explore ways to teach all language learners in the section coming up on teaching concepts. Please don't leave that chair. Hang in there. Dr. Susan Popplewell of Oklahoma State University and Kelly Forbes, master teacher, are going to share their expertise and provide examples of how it's done in the classroom in the next lessons in this series. You will see classroom footage of ELL instruction in action. Thanks for spending time with us today. The resources on the next 2 slides and on this webpage invite your further exploration. But do check out all of the lessons on teaching all language learners, Teaching TAL.